Thank you. My name is Nadelm. I'm the head of the Drug Policy Alliance. Quick question for the camera. What's that for? Is it your personal use for the conference? Or?
It actually is personal.
Okay.
Well, personal. I'm here for work.
Okay. Okay. So I am. I used to be an academic, and I have been for many years an activist. And most of the work of myself and my organization is in the United States. We advocate for reforming the way we deal with drugs in this country on everything from decriminalizing or legalizing marijuana to rolling back Rockefeller drug laws in New York to trying to reduce AIDS and overdose through public health measures to stimulating a broader debate about legalization and what have you. The people that we represent in our organization range from those people who would legalize everything, whether from a libertarian perspective or from a non-libertarian perspective, to those people who are not comfortable with legalizing anything, but basically think we should decriminalize drug possession, treat addiction as a health issue, reduce the overall incarceration, address the massive racial injustices of the drug war, etc. So that's the spectrum that we represent. Most of my work's in the United States, but some of it is in outside the United States. And recently, a large amount of my time has been devoted over the last month and a half to what's going on outside the United States, which is why I accepted the invitation from Fred to come speak here in place of my colleague Daniel. I should say also at the beginning that I don't think that major drug policy reform, whether it's legalization or other parts of reform, is going to solve all the world's problems. I think that the levels of violence that one sees, I apologize to Charlie for my opening when he mentioned his Cuernavaca, I made some ignorant comment about violence, and I apologize for that. But I think that I don't think that changing the way we deal with drugs is fundamentally going to change overall levels of violence, but it will have a positive impact. I do think that the problems of poverty and social dislocation and all sorts of other power imbalances are going to be there, and that changing the way we deal with drugs is not going to reform all of that either. But the bottom line is that even if everything else were to remain constant in the world, from injustice to racial injustice to economic inequality to absence of rule of law, the fact of the matter is that fundamentally changing the way we deal with illegal drugs around the world would have a major positive impact across the board. Most particularly on people who are poor and people who are color, most particularly in reducing levels of both organized violence and also lower levels of violence, most particularly in diminishing the power of criminal organizations, reducing the dynamism and the profits of black markets. So I should say all that. I think that when you look at the negative consequences of the war on drugs, what you see in Latin America or Afghanistan or now growing parts of West Africa and elsewhere, parts of East Asia, is that you see the most negative consequences are the result of the failures of a prohibitionist policy. Not unlike what happened with alcohol prohibition in America back in the 20s and 30s, right? The crime, violence, corruption, black markets, disrespect for law, all of this sort of stuff, as well as drugs being adulterated and more dangerous and leading to those sorts of fatalities. Am I talking too fast, by the way? I am where you are. In the United States, if one looks at negative consequences, what you see is first and foremost what's happening in our prison population. Many of you know these numbers. The United States is less than 5% of the world's population, but almost 25% of the world's incarcerated population. We rank first in the world in per capita incarceration of our fellow citizens. The racial elements of this are over the top. Absolutely extraordinary. It makes like the rates of incarceration in the Soviet gulags of the 30s look minor compared to the rates of incarceration of black men in America today. The violations of civil liberties in our country, human rights abroad, also the devastation of HIV/AIDS and the millions of people who died because we did not treat that properly as a health issue as opposed to a criminal issue when it came to directing drug users. So there's a huge range of horrors associated with this failed prohibitionist strategy. And it's also accept that the notion of legalizing drugs like that is not going to happen. So it's a matter of evolving the strategy from a criminal justice militaristic policy that's dominant throughout the world and embedded in international institutions over the last century, down the spectrum towards a policy that decriminalizes possession, treats addiction as a health issue, begins to take marijuana entirely out of the criminal justice system, and finds other ways to deal with the drugs like heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, since they will probably never be legalized like alcohol or cigarettes, but we can find ways to diminish the power of those markets. Now, I'm very excited because stuff is really happening in the last month and a half. And I was in Mexico and in Guatemala last month, and I can talk about some of that. Some of these were private meetings that I cannot talk about, which is why I asked in part about the camera there.
I'm not the only one in the room.
Oh, no, that's fine, but I'd love a copy actually if you have it later. But what I will say is this. And I should also just say, the other thing I just need to say just as context is, the work I do brings together people from across the political spectrum, from the far left to the far right, to the libertarian, to everything in the middle, right? I mean, it's one of the remarkable things about the growing drug policy reform movement. We also bring together people from across the drug use spectrum, right? From people who love drugs and, you know, for marijuana or their psychedelics is a pivotal part of their life, to people who have been devastated by drugs, you know, either in their families, their own lives, on whatever the drug may be, to people who don't give a damn about drugs, right? But just basically believe the war on drugs is not the way to deal with this stuff. And it also spans across the drug law spectrum, from those people who spent 20 years behind bars on a nonviolent drug charge to those people who spent their lives enforcing drug laws and now think it was all a waste, to people who have no relationship to this. So we really span the spectrum, and it's a fascinating challenge keeping coalitions together that come from across a political spectrum, a drug use spectrum, and a drug law spectrum. Now, what's remarkable is really that there are a couple of things going on, and the way I look at this strategically as an activist is the number one target of our efforts ultimately, at this point, is the US federal government, right? That is really the bastion. It has been the leader of the global war on drugs for more or less the last 100 years, although the Russians seem ready to seize the baton from us and really become, I mean, the Russians really in the last couple of years have replaced the US in terms of really venal aggressive drug war action. But we have been the lead until very, very recently, and because of our role, we still play a dominant role. It's also true that as things begin to change within the United States, the federal government's the last place that you're going to see things change, right? So I'm looking at this strategically about how does all this come together to bring pressure on the federal government, on the administration, whoever it might be, and on Congress to change. Now, the two most dynamic things happening in the world today, one of them is happening in Latin America, and the other one is happening in the United States of America. And those are the two things I want to focus on. There's other stuff going on in Europe, there's other stuff going on here and there, but let me focus on these two pieces, and I could talk about this for days, so I'm just going to isolate this in a few minutes. In Latin America, what is happening is that you are seeing growing support for legalization, decriminalization, or what could simply be said, putting all options on the table, opening the dialogue, opening the debate in a way that is absolutely extraordinary and of historic significance. The arguments, and when I say the arguments, I refer to the argument for legalization, which many people have different meanings of, decriminalization and many different meanings of, but putting all options on the table and breaking the taboo on discussing alternative drug policies. It has gone from an argument that was heard primarily by intellectuals and activists and the occasional odd person here and there just 5-10 years ago, to an argument being put forward by former presidents and ministers beginning 3 or 4 years ago, to, in the last few months, an argument being put forward by current presidents. That is of historic significance, right? So 4 years ago, and I should say that I've been deeply involved in all these efforts behind the scenes and sometimes in front of the scenes. And also, if you want to read some of this stuff, I wrote a piece in the Huffington Post that went up a few days ago on Sunday, which summarized some of this stuff. And I did an interview on Amy Goodman's show, Democracy Now!, last Friday, 8 days ago. And the transcript of that is on Alternet right now. So you can see summaries of this stuff on Huffington Post, Democracy Now!, and Alternet. But 3-4 years ago, you had a coming together of a few presidents: Cardoso from Brazil, Gaviria from Colombia, Zedillo from Mexico, all kind of center-right sort of politicians, basically saying, and they pulled in a whole range of other intellectuals or ministers, newspaper publishers, etc., basically, and came out with a powerful statement that said the war on drugs has failed, we need to put all alternatives on the table, break the taboo, talk about decriminalization, look at what the Europeans are doing with their public health harm reduction policies. Those guys then followed up with a global commission on drug policy, right? And which came out with its report June of last year, and that enlisted the same 3 presidents, but now they got the former president of Switzerland, they got Richard Branson, the businessman, they got George Shultz and Paul Volcker, George Shultz, the former Republican Secretary of Everything, I think, and Paul Volcker, the former Federal Reserve Board chair, and they got other European leaders, Javier Solana, the European minister, Papandreou, the former Prime Minister of Greece, etc., etc. And they went a step further. They said not just break the taboo. They basically said it's time to talk about the legal regulation of cannabis. It's time to investigate other legal regulatory models. And they were very bold, not just talking about drug addiction as a health issue, but said we also need to look at the decriminalization not just of the user, but of the low-level addict dealer and of the courier. That was a bold move for these guys, mostly some on the center-left, but mostly center-right to make. And that thing generated global media attention throughout Latin America, even hit Asia and Africa for the first time of all. Now, part of what happened there was, you know, among the current presidents, I mean, you have a range of interesting things happening that were more on the left. You have Evo Morales, who's out there saying legalize coca. He's in Vienna last week at the annual UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs. It's a perfectly credible argument. The inclusion of coke in the international drug conventions is based upon the racism against the Indios back in the 50s and 60s. So he's totally on strong scientific grounds, but Bolivia is not a very effective diplomatic player. And they aren't taking this coke argument and making it more broadly, right? You have Chavez, who loves to, you know, to the U.S. all the time, but basically he's almost like a drug warrior. I mean, the interesting thing is the U.S.'s best ally in being a drug warrior in Latin America is Cuba, right? I mean, those are the two of the harshest policies. And in Central America right now, or ironically, it's Ortega in Nicaragua, right? Chavez is, you know, there's the corruption and all the stuff with the FARC, and blah, blah, blah. But I mean, basically, his thing is not about drug policy reform, it's more about what he can do in the U.S. And then Correa in Ecuador is very interesting because he comes into office early on. His father was behind bars for selling drugs, right? And he's very sensitive to this issue. He pushes through a decriminalization bill. He does a massive clemency. He kicks the U.S. DEA and other drug enforcement out of the military base in Manta. So he starts off, but then, because of growing crime problems in Ecuador and his changing political profile, he's stopped being a leader on this. So you have this rumblings out of the left in a way, but then out of the right, you have first these ex-presidents, and then President Santos in Colombia, former Defense Minister Uribe, right, who has made interesting indications. He begins to say, let's open this up. And he begins to float these arguments here and there, right? In fact, one of the things he did, interesting, this is part of the connection, is that in the fall of 2010, when the California marijuana legalization issue was on the ballot, Prop 19, he convenes a summit with 4 or 5 other Latin American presidents. And the whole public frame of the summit is, oh my God, if these Californians vote to legalize marijuana, us down here are dying to keep the drugs from coming up. This would be terrible. And privately, he is saying, we hope it wins, we hope it wins. Same thing with the Mexican diplomats in the U.S. Publicly condemning it, privately rooting for it, and letting people know the way that they feel that way. Santos starts floating this stuff in the last few months, and then out of the blue, and this happened to happen, Otto Perez Molina, the former general who was involved in the dirty wars of the 80s, but then who was the one who brings the military into the peace agreement in the 90s and also opposes the coup, so he's this interesting character, center-right, just elected president, right? And he says we got to put legalization on the table. Right? Fascinating. I happen to be flying down there like the week that he starts to announce this stuff, to speak about this stuff, so it creates this incredible opportunity where I'm giving these speeches, and the next thing I know, all sorts of people in the government and ministers are calling me about how to talk about this stuff, and the business community is getting engaged. But what you see is that he's now showing leadership on this stuff. He then, 2 weeks ago, sends his vice president, Roxanne Paldetti, around to the Central American government saying, are you ready to have a conversation about this stuff? Meanwhile, Janet Napolitano is doing the same tour at the same time, making a fool of herself, saying, well, the drug war is actually working okay, you know, at least we cut off the heads of the big guys, and you know, people are looking, what are you, lunatic? You know, so essentially these competing tours by these two women, the Guatemalan wins, and so what's happening is all the Central American presidents, I think all or all but one, are coming to Guatemala a week from today for an open conference about alternative drug control policies, including decriminalization and legalization. Never before happened in history. Calderon and Santos were both invited to this thing, but they're not going to this meeting, but they will be having conversations with these people as well. At the Summit of the Americas coming up a month from today, April 14th and 15th in Cartagena, what you're going to see happen there is Santos and Otto Perez Molina have already said that they both want this thing on the agenda, right? I was at a meeting in American Dialogue 2 days in Washington, and you know, this is the subject now, and the State Department organized this thing is going, you know, they're nervous, like, what do we do? And the fact of the matter is the U.S. government is not prepared because there is such an ideological prohibition. They've been talking about this stuff that there are not even internal memorandum, to my knowledge, within any of the national security agencies even thinking about this stuff. It's just, we're opposed to it. But Biden goes down a few weeks ago, right? And, you know, there's ways to get to Biden, and basically he goes down, he says, we're against this, but we acknowledge it's a legitimate subject for debate. And that little concession, which then gets reiterated by State Department spokesmen over the last 10 days or so, now has become headlines in a couple of places. U.S. now open to discussion. Not exactly the way that they wanted to frame it, but nonetheless it is a little tiny opening. So there's something dramatic going on here. In Mexico, it's interesting, because 5-6 years ago, Colombia would have a conversation at this. In the intellectual world, a lot of people running for president in Colombia are speaking to this stuff from across the political spectrum. Mexico, almost no discussion in Mexico. It was kind of pathetic in a way. But what starts happening in the last few years is the following. First of all, Ernesto Zedillo, the president to back, he's part of this global commission now, significant. You have intellectuals like Fuentes or Enrique Krauss who are beginning to speak out on this stuff. You have Jorge Castaneda, who's making this argument before he becomes Fox's foreign minister, goes quiet when he's in government, comes back out, and he's all over the place making this argument. He combines with the editor of Nexos, an influential Mexican intellect, Hector, anybody knows his name? Whatever his name is. Influential magazine publishing. They're making this argument. Then Vicente Fox pops out, and he's not saying open the debate. He's saying just legalize the damn stuff, right? And then you have Calderon, who on the one hand has waged this war against criminal organizations, all of this sort of stuff. You know, he can claim, as you said, you know, there's some growing of judicial institutions, and that's been a significant investment that's not getting the attention it should get. He can claim at least they've retained some sovereignty of territory from some of the gangsters, but 50,000 dead, and still, it's a number, you know, it's a lot, right? I mean, and the violence in some parts of the country, right? And so he's torn. And there's the political part of his brain. There's a part of his brain that's on the commander-in-chief, and we don't want to lower the morale of the military. But then there's a kind of libertarian Milton Friedman part of his brain. I mean, the guy went to Stanford or whatever. He studied economics. And so he comes to the U.S., and he's pissed off about the guns flowing down and all this drug war nonsense. And a few months ago, he starts saying, we got to start, if the U.S. cannot reduce the demand for drugs, they need to look at market alternatives, code word for legalization. And then in December, you have the Tuxtla Declaration of Central American and Mexican presidents, and they say the same thing there, right? And then, a few weeks ago, his foreign minister, Patricia Espinosa, announces that the Mexican government is now open for a debate on legalization. So all of a sudden, you got Santos, you have Calderon putting a couple of toes in the water right now. You have Otto Perez Molina, the first former general. I mean, Santos was a civilian defense minister, a former general, who thereby sends a message to the military, which is the most opposed to really thinking about this creatively. There's this dynamic amount of activity going on there right now, right? Now, U.S. government, like that, right? But what's happening in the United States is remarkable. The most remarkable, you have your governors begin to say this prison incarceration is costing too much. You have African American leaders going, my God, how can we ever support the drug war? You know, all it's ever done is locked up our people without protecting us from drug addiction. But on the marijuana issue, there's a dramatic transformation happening in America. In 2006, according to the annual Gallup poll, 36% of Americans said they were in favor of legalizing marijuana, and 60% were opposed. That 36% was the highest ever. That's 2006. In November of last year, 5 years later, end of 2011, the 36% in favor of legalizing marijuana had become 50% in support of legalizing marijuana. The 60% against had become 46% against. 14-point increase in support, 14-point decrease in opposition, 28-point swing in the space of 5 years, a bigger swing in public opinion than we've seen on gay marriage in America in the last 5 years. First time in American history that we've seen more people saying yes to marijuana legalization than opposed, right? Meanwhile, the cops are busting as many people as ever for marijuana possession. It's half of all drug arrests in America, and grossly racially disproportionate, as some of the good research has been showing on this stuff, right? You're going to have marijuana legalization initiatives on the ballot in Colorado and Washington State this year. Both are ahead in the polls. Both will be uphill battles to win, but it's probably going to happen sometime, if not this year, the next 4 years. And in Latin America, everybody, when I go down there, is saying, oh my God, California almost legalized. What's going to happen? And like people in Mexico, Guatemala know about the marijuana legalization initiatives that are happening in Colorado and Washington State. So what's happening is, essentially, if you look at the federal government as a target of this thing, I think what's happening is, what you have coming out of Latin America, Mexico, South America, and now Central America, where there was no debate, literally, until 2 months ago, and all of a sudden it's bubbling up. And not just from the right. You have the business community also on the right. In Monterrey and Mexico City, totally flipped out about the growing power of the narcos and their fears that they can't compete, and the violence, the kidnapping, all this sort of stuff. Then you have Javier Sicilia. Javier Sicilia, you know, the poet turned social justice leader, whose kid was killed, leading the social justice movement from the left, right? He is throwing in the drug reform thing, but then we do a biennial conference, International Drug Conference. He comes to our conference in November and gets engaged and focused on this stuff. So he's now more and more speaking the language of drug policy reform as well. He is coming to the United States this fall to do a caravan in the United States like he did in Mexico. My organization, Drug Policy Alliance, is working very closely with them to organize this sort of thing. The Mexican human rights community, which 5 years ago was like this on the drug thing, they were scared shitless, they are now increasingly engaged on this sort of stuff as well. There's a Mexican drug reform organization called Cupid that has people from the human rights community getting engaged. So what you see is this from here, what's happening, I think what's going to be key, it's going to be more at the elite level than anything else. Public opinion in Mexico and elsewhere is lagging behind on drug reform. But it's going to be the military, the diplomatic, the business, the media, the intellectual elites speaking to their counterparts in the United States. That's where this is going to play there. And in the United States, interestingly enough, it's going to be at the level of civil society, public opinion, and state government, pushing it, especially on the marijuana issue, beginning to call out. This is a multi-year, probably multi-generational process. But I am very excited because in 2012, in March right now, I've been involved in this for more than a couple of decades. And what's happening right now, both in the United States on the marijuana issue, and what's happening in Latin America on the issue of opening up the debate, are historically unprecedented, and there is momentum with both that is truly extraordinary. I'll stop there.
10 minutes for, why don't we take a bunch of questions, and then each of the panelists can respond to as many questions as there are. Yes?
To the last speaker, when you said drug reform refers only to marijuana reform, or
No.
the whole gamut?
No, it refers to the whole gamut, but it does not refer to legalization of everything, right? So it basically is the way to think about drug policy reform is to imagine a spectrum of drug policy options, from the most punitive Singapore, Saudi Arabia, cut off their heads, drug test everybody, and lock them up, to the most free market, libertarian, Milton Friedman's wet dream, right, over here, right? You know, essentially the cigarette model of the 60s, basically, with no controls except maybe to kids. And the whole idea is moving the spectrum of policy to reduce the mandatory minimums, reduce the incarceration, reduce the violation of civil liberties, treat addiction as a health issue, shift it more and more down here to a sort of European public health model, try to take marijuana out of it. And basically what I'm fighting for, I and my organization, is to shift the locus of policy in the US and globally from where it is over here, if here's the spectrum, to shift it from here to here, and to shift the debate from here to here, because I think ultimately the optimal drug policy, which I would define as the one that most successfully does two things, that most successfully reduces the harms of drugs and the harms of government policies. That the optimal policy is going to lie someplace over here, someplace between the libertarian vision and what might be called the harm reduction prohibitionist vision. So it refers to this whole spectrum of things, but the legalization option in the alcohol tobacco sense of legalization is most realistic and probably, I don't know if it's inevitable, but it's heading that way with marijuana, but not with the other drugs.
Yes.
I begin by agreeing with Charlie that Mexico is not a failed state and not likely to become a failed state. But Mexico does illustrate, and this whole drug war thing illustrates the limited capacity of government. And that's true in Mexico, it's true throughout Latin America. Those governments in Mexico is by no means as compromised as many other governments in the world, but very few of the governments we deal with in what used to be the third world have the capacity to make effective change. They're not there, and we keep treating them, we American policymakers keep treating them as if they could do these things, or as if, alternatively, a little dose of the American military will transform their countries into democracies. So without that effective government capacity, things like global warming become extraordinarily problematic, because without regard to what the government's promised to do, they can't implement it. They can't implement things related to clean water. They can't implement things related to more equitable distribution of income. There are all kinds of things they can't do, and what the drug war does is shine a light on that.
I think it's interesting, about just to respond to that you know, there are people who claim, well, we can't move in the direction of legally regulating the drugs that are illegal because these governments don't have the infrastructure ability to do that. But one always has to look at things relatively. If they don't, they almost certainly have a better capacity to do that than they have a capacity to implement a prohibitionist policy. I mean, that's what's being so devastatingly destructive today. So these are all matters of relative incapacity. And I think, you know, given a choice between a weak state, they're not failed states, but weak states struggling one or the other, imposing a sort of prohibitionist model on a dynamic global commodities market.
See, I'm trying to get away from your narrow topic here.
Let's take a few more comments and questions, and then let's all have one last round of.
To rolling back Rockefeller drug laws in New York, to trying to reduce AIDS and overdose is through public health measures to stimulating a broader debate about legalization and what have you. The people that we represent in our organization range from those people who would legalize everything, whether from a libertarian perspective or from a non-libertarian perspective, to those people who are not comfortable with legalizing anything, but basically think we should decriminalize drug possession, treat addiction as a health issue, reduce the overall incarceration, address the massive racial injustices of the drug war, etc. So that's the spectrum that we represent. Most of my work's in the United States, but some of it is in outside the United States, and also lower levels of violence, most particularly in diminishing the power of criminal organizations, reducing the dynamism and the profits of black markets. So I should say all that. I think that when you look at the negative consequences of the war on drugs, what you see in Latin America or Afghanistan or now growing parts of West Africa and elsewhere, parts of East Asia, is that you see the most negative consequences are the result of the failures of a prohibitionist policy. Not unlike what happened with alcohol and prohibition in America back in the 20s and 30s, right? The crime, violence, corruption, black markets, disrespect for law, all of this sort of stuff, as well as drugs being adulterated and more dangerous and leading to those sorts of fatalities. Positive impact. I do think that the problems of poverty and social dislocation and all sorts of other power imbalances are going to be there, and that changing the way we deal with drugs is not going to reform all of that either. But the bottom line is that even if everything else were to remain constant in the world, from injustice to racial injustice to economic inequality to absence of rule of law, the fact of the matter is that fundamentally changing the way we deal with illegal drugs around the world would have a major positive impact across the board. Most particularly on people who are poor and people who are color, most particularly in reducing levels of both organized violence. And recently, a large amount of my time has been devoted over the last month and a half to what's going on outside the United States, which is why I accepted the invitation from Fred to come speak here in place of my colleague Daniel. I should say also at the beginning that I don't think that major drug policy reform, whether it's legalization or other parts of reform, is going to solve all the world's problems. I think that the levels of violence that one sees, I apologize to Charlie for my opening, when he mentioned his Cuernavaca, I made some ignorant comment about violence, and I apologize for that. But I think that, I don't think that changing the way we deal with drugs is fundamentally going to change overall levels of violence, but it will have a positive. Thank you. My name is Ethan Nadelm. I'm the head of the Drug Policy Alliance. Quick question for the camera. What's that for? Is it your personal use for the conference? Or?
It actually is personal.
Okay.
Well, personal. I'm here for work.
Okay. So I used to be an academic, and I have been for many years an activist. And most of the work of myself and my organization is in the United States. We advocate for reforming the way we deal with drugs in this country on everything from decriminalizing or legalizing marijuana